Okay. Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another session of our expert-led series. My name is Cynthia Ademola. I'm from Nigeria, and I'll be the host for today. So I'm so excited to have everyone here for the Global Citizenship Foundation Capacity Building Session, which is tagged the Level Up series. And today we'll be diving into practical strategies for upskilling with a major focus on developing cognitive skills to tackle challenges. Please take a moment to introduce yourselves in the chat box. Let us know your name and where you're joining from. Welcome, Casey.
Thank you.
Okay, welcome, Lynn Wachira from Kenya. Well, thank you, everyone. As you join in, you can always introduce yourselves and where you're joining from in the chat box. So thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Your commitment to growth and professional development is truly inspiring. In today's session, we're going to share insights and experiences that will help us to sharpen our skills, to boost our confidence, and to take our careers to the next level. So let's all get ready for an engaging and interactive experience. And now it's my pleasure to introduce to us our speaker for today, our expert speaker for today's session, Casey Schmalaka. Welcome, Casey.
Thank you so much. Shall I get started? Go ahead.
Yeah. Casey brings over a decade of experience in coaching individuals to think more flexibly, to solve problems strategically, and to thrive in dynamic environments. He is the vice president of the New Frontiers Executive Function Coaching, and he leads initiatives that empower students, professionals, and teams to build core cognitive skills, which are essential for success. And this includes adaptability, metacognition, and decision-making under uncertainty. Known for blending insights with action, Casey's work emphasizes real-world application, including helping interns and early career professionals to reframe challenges, to embrace diverse perspectives, and to bounce back from setbacks with creative, solution-oriented thinking. From guiding through complex transitions or designing professional development programs, Casey equips individuals to lead with resilience, collaborate effectively, and leverage flexible thinking as a catalyst for long-term career growth. So with this, let's all give a warm welcome to Casey. So Casey, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for having me. So let me just get this looking good. And now I'll share my screen. So today we're going to be discussing cognitive flexibility and how it is an essential skill in supporting growth as a professional. Before I jump in, I do just want to encourage ask questions throughout. You can type them into the chat. You can use the Q&A function. Whichever way, I find it makes the presentation more engaging. And I'd much rather be speaking to the questions you guys have than what I am setting out to discuss. So I I heavily encourage it. We'll also have time at the end if you do want to save your questions for the end. So, developing cognitive flexibility to tackle challenges, building adaptability, resilience, and strategic thinking. So, as introduced before, I'm Casey Schmaliker, Vice President at New Frontiers. I've been doing this for about 13 years now, working with students, professionals, teams, really running the gamut. And my focus has been on developing core cognitive skills like adaptability, metacognition, decision making under uncertainty. So I really do work on a whole host of these skills called executive functions, and we're going to be focusing on one sliver of that today. So we'll start off with just a bit of an opening. I'm going to have some exercises that I'd love for you guys to participate in. And then we're going to go into understanding cognitive flexibility, recognizing and overcoming rigid thinking, enhancing decision making and emotional resilience, bringing it all together. And then we'll have a Q&A section and then a conclusion and thank you. So let's warm up our thinking. I'd like all of you to reflect on a time that you've had to change your mind about something or that you wish you had. What made it difficult or helpful to shift your thinking or approach? And you can share this briefly over in the chat. This could be a moment at work or in life where you either adapted or got stuck. And while you guys are sharing over, I'm going to also just share over one of mine where I have found myself, and this happened yesterday, where I was engaging in communication with a colleague and I felt like I had to keep proving my point. When really that aspect of proving my point wasn't serving me. It wasn't helping in the situation, and I wasn't able to pivot in the moment. And so that's one example of I was being rigid in my approach. And so I'll give a couple of more seconds to see if anyone does want to share or add anything. But I don't see anyone typing. Okay, I see a note taker typing. So I'll probably go ahead unless someone has something, but I'll keep checking to see if anyone shares over. So as we continue to go through, if you do have any situations that you do think of, I'll check back in the chat and reflect on it. Oh, I do see someone typing, so I'll give it a minute. And this is just for me to get an understanding of how you guys think about flexibility in approach or rigidity in your approaches that you may have. So we'll go ahead while that's finished typing, just to start moving forward, and then I will come back and revisit that. So really what we're looking at about understanding cognitive flexibility is that this enables you to respond constructively when faced with new, complex, or uncertain situations. It also supports adaptation when your previous approaches did not work well. So what we're really thinking about here is when you make decisions or when you think about things, there's multiple ways you can react, that you can approach these things. But sometimes when we're being rigid, it feels like there's only one option. So cognitive flexibility is really that ability to shift your thinking, adapt to new information, and approach challenges from different angles. And it matters because when you have more flexibility, you have more options for how you act or react, your growth, and your connection. So I'll just pause to go to an example that was shared by Malika. So I face this difficulty about embracing AI in my academics. It takes a lot of courage to welcome artificial intelligence take over bright students, but I had to change my mind that we got to adapt to this innovation. It's a perfect example. As you get into professional fields, there's going to be constant changes. That's how companies grow and stay competitive. And so often you need to be ready to adapt. This could also happen when you have something like a SOP, a standard operating procedure. That may change. And just because you've always done things a way before doesn't mean that's how you're going to do it moving forward. And so you'll often see it in periods with companies when there's major changes that some people don't keep up and they may not survive those big changes of a company. And so the more flexible you are, the more adaptable you are, the more likely you are able to grow with any private organization or any organization just in your professional field. The more flexible you are, the better a team player you are. And so we are going to be exploring how cognitive flexibility is really impacting three main areas. It's what we're paying attention to, what we're attending to, how we interpret our world, and how we respond to our world. And so these are going to be these three dimensions of flexibility that we talk about. So we do have what we choose to focus on, and this is our attention. So when you're flexible here, you may be able to shift your attention between different aspects of a situation. So, for example, you may realize that the real issue isn't a missed deadline, but a breakdown of team communication. So it's what you're focusing on there. So I didn't get the project from my team that I was supposed to get on time. That was the outcome. But am I paying attention to someone's lazy? Am I paying attention to um, where people didn't communicate with one another? Am I paying attention to did I give enough direction? So, what you're choosing to focus on can really influence outcomes in situations because you can lead to different outcomes based off of what you choose to focus on. There also is this second area of how we interpret what's happening, and this is the interpretation piece. So, now you might understand that there's a breakdown of communication. But how do we interpret that breakdown of communication? Do we focus on certain people there? Do we interpret it as they're being lazy or they don't care? Do we interpret it in other ways? So, how you interpret situations can also be a dimension of flexibility. And then we have what most people focus on when they think about rigidity and flexibility, but this is our response. So, it's how we react or respond. And so, you have something you're focusing on, a situation and a certain aspect of it. We're interpreting it in a certain way, but then it turns into how are we reacting or responding to that situation? So, this is where it's about choosing different strategies or emotional responses. So, instead of shutting down after a mistake, maybe asking for feedback and making a plan. These are two different ways to approach the same situation. So, and keep in mind those three. We're going to be revisiting those. But let's first look at why rigidity and how this stuck thinking can really limit our growth. So, rigidity is the removal of strategic thinking. If you only have one way to approach a problem, you're always going to get a similar outcome. So let's use an academic example because it's very concrete. Let's say you study for an exam and you study using index cards, little note cards, or Quizlet, and you get a 70 on the exam. Someone who is rigid may study for their exam using index cards again. They're going to use the same approach, the same action. But you're going to then expect that you may get another 70 on that exam. But someone with more cognitive flexibility may approach that as that way of studying didn't work for me. And so I'll use my example from yesterday. If I only approach conversations with my colleagues that I have to prove myself right, that's going to limit my ability to connect and collaborate with my colleagues. So next time I go to have a team meeting with these colleagues, I'm going to be strategic and try to think about how can I adapt how I communicate. That's strategic thinking. You are focusing on what you can change in order to lead to different outcomes. So when we're rigid, it's removing that strategic thinking. And rigidity often is tricking the brain into believing that the current path is the only rational or efficient option, even when it's not. So instead of evaluating and adjusting, we end up locking in and shutting down possibilities of what can be done differently. And so rigidity can show up when we avoid feedback or change because it feels uncomfortable, when we over-identify with a specific outcome or belief, when we cling to one perspective even when it's not working, and when we react impulsively without space to evaluate. Now, I want to highlight that when we're being rigid, it's hard to see it in the moment. And so rigidity is important to reflect on. It's important to reflect on, and we're going to go through ways how this helps build things up. But I just want to help everyone really understand that it's not something that it's just very easy in the moment to say I'm being rigid. And we'll talk a bit about why. I'm going to just stop and again encourage any questions that anyone may have, any comments throughout to get the most out of this presentation. So, as growing professionals and as you're entering your field, it can be very important that the younger you are, the easier it is to be more flexible and to adapt this flexibility. And so when you're growing as a professional, really understanding where this rigidity can set you down certain paths. So rigidity can limit your ability to collaborate and navigate differing opinions. So as you enter the professional world, you're going to be engaging with very different people. And in order to collaborate with these people, you may need to adapt. And then let's say you're a growing professional and maybe you start managing a team of people. Now you have to manage a team and they're not going to necessarily adapt to you because they might be struggling with rigidity. So now in order to manage, you need to be more adaptable, more flexible to adapt to your team. It also can hinder creativity and adaptability in fast-changing environments. So if you are in a more growth-oriented organization, it's going to hinder your ability to keep up with that fast-changing environment. It can lead to poor leadership choices by defaulting to control instead of curiosity. A big thing in leadership is you may have people that you're leading that are actually better than you at certain tasks. And being humble about that and curious about that and learning from them. If you're rigid, you may struggle to learn from others. It also undermines trust and emotional intelligence in relationships, and it can stall your career growth by resisting feedback or change. And that's one of the big things that people look for when promoting individuals and when trying to elevate people through career growth is feedback and change is a very important aspect. because in order to keep growing, you have to keep learning. And one of the best tools for learning and growth in a job and a career is by receiving feedback. So, in other words, it's not just what happens, it's how we choose to engage with it. So, cognitive flexibility, I like to use, and then I have a little typo that I left out here, so please ignore that. But cognitive flexibility can be thought of as a set of levers that we can pull. And these levers are those three domains that we discussed before: what we notice, how we frame it, and what we do next. These are all variables that we have control over, but we may need to flex those cognitive flexibility muscles to get more used to using them. And adjusting any of these can lead to different outcomes. So I wanted to just present over this one scenario and show that it can lead to many different outcomes. So you may present an idea in a meeting and your colleague immediately challenges it in front of others. There's more than three, but here's three different ways that you're able to focus on, or what you focus on. So you can focus on that they embarrassed me in front of the rest of the team. Another typo, my apologies. You can focus on that they may have misunderstood the concept, or you can focus on the fact that they're asking questions and trying to challenge you to make it better. So three different ways of what you can focus on. You can focus on that it was an attack on you. You can focus on that there was constructive criticism being given back, or you can focus on maybe that they misunderstood it. Three different ways of what to focus on. You can also focus on how to interpret this. And so this could be they're trying to undermine me. This could be they value rigorous discussion. And this could be they're worried the idea might not work. Now, all three on what you focus on can also be interpreted in any of these ways. So it's not just linear. Maybe they embarrassed me in front of the team, and you interpret that as they're worried the idea might not work. So it's showing that there are these levers of what we do here. And now you can also influence how you respond to it. You can get defensive or shut down. You could ask clarifying questions, or you can thank them and suggest a follow-up conversation. And so it's almost like I don't know if some of you guys are familiar, there used to be these kids' books of like choose your own adventure, that when you get to the end of a chapter, you decide which path to take and you turn to that page. And so that aspect of choose your own adventure, or for anyone who plays video games, like there's video games where you can make decisions and it leads to different outcomes. That's what these levers are like. What you're choosing to focus on is one lever of choose your own adventure. How you interpret it can be different ways, which leads to different outcomes, and how you respond can lead to different outcomes. And so it's just understanding that this is where our brains are making decisions that's what we can control. We can't control others. Now, cognitive flexibility doesn't work alone. So while it is very powerful and interconnected, there are these 5 additional skill areas which we're going to talk about, what help us access and adjust these levers that we just presented over of flexible thinking. So we will be looking at metacognition, which is the awareness of your own thought processes. We'll be looking at adaptability, which is adjusting behavior or plans based on new information or changing circumstances. We'll be looking at emotional regulation, where we're managing our emotional reactions to stay constructive. We'll be looking at strategic thinking, so evaluating different paths and choosing intentional actions. And then we'll be looking at inhibitory controls, which is the ability to pause automatic responses and consider alternatives. So we know these 5 foundational skills, and we'll be going through how to really understand recognizing real-world challenges that activate rigid thinking. We'll see which levers, focus, interpretation, and response are being pulled or stuck, and then apply practical strategies to strengthen each of the skills. So, metacognition, it's noticing your thinking. And so, what is metacognition? Really, to understand the skill. Metacognition is the ability to observe, question, and reflect on your own thinking process. So, it's thinking about thinking. It's understanding your own strengths and weaknesses. It's being able to know if a strategy you may want to use is applying to your strengths, or is it applying to your weaknesses? Without self-awareness, it's hard to know what needs to shift. And so let me go back to my example yesterday. I may have had, so for those that maybe joined a little bit later, I've been using this example in a meeting where I kept feeling like I had to prove my point and prove that I was correct. Now, metacognition can help me understand what led to that, what trigger set off that reaction. Metacognition would help me understand, how do I know the signs that I'm being rigid or that I'm approaching a certain point? And so metacognition is really being able to stop and reflect on how you're thinking, and is this serving me or not? And so it gives the perspective to recognize when your current focus, interpretation, or response may be limiting your options. Now, common pitfalls, common struggles with this might be reacting without realizing how you got there. It could follow repeating the same approach even though you know it's not working. There could be an inability to articulate what you were thinking or why. And it might lead to some confusing of emotion or assumption with fact. And so metacognition, just like cognitive flexibility, is something that takes practice. It's a way of thinking. And by doing it multiple times, that's what really helps out there. And so just to look at our levers, metacognition is influencing our focus, it's influencing our interpretation, and it's influencing our response. Because metacognition is really that core ability to say, what was I focusing on and why was I focusing on that? Was there some reason why my brain decided to focus on that? And did that help me or not? Interpretation also, it's why was I interpreting it that way? What about this situation led to me interpret it that way? Metacognition is really that ability to be self-critical and look in a mirror and understand why your brain reacted and responded and focused and interpreted in the way it did. And then response, as I just said, it is that really, why did I do that? What was I thinking in the moment? How did that serve me? And how can I think about it differently next time? So in terms of just some strategies to build up metacognition, there's this aspect of mental check-ins where you ask yourself, what am I thinking right now? And by doing this a couple of times a day, you're building up that metacognitive muscle. You're building up your ability to begin thinking critically about your own thought processes. Another is thought labeling. So this again is just pausing to think about how am I thinking about this thought style? So this might be things, I'm making assumptions right now. I'm catastrophizing right now. I'm planning right now. It's just labeling what that strategy is, what that approach is. And again, sometimes this takes practice to build up to better identify. And that's why that first strategy of mental check-ins is so useful, because it's really helping understand. It's building those muscles so that you get better at naming your thought style. Then there's reflective journaling. And so after some key moments, write down and what you were thinking. Do it closer to the moment. How were things shaping your actions and what did you learn? So while it is good to do this whenever, the closer it is to the situation, the more accurate your metacognition is. Because even when just a couple of hours go by, your brain is already filling in the gaps of your memory. And it might be biasing how you think about this. And so, if you reflect in key moments close to the situation, you're going to have a better, accurate understanding of thinking about your thinking. And then you can use is that true prompt. So, challenge your own thinking with light skepticism to catch bias or distortion. And so, even if you just write down or say something out loud and then challenge yourself, is this true? How do I know it's true? Or was I making assumptions? What could other perspectives be? Why maybe was I thinking this way? Again, just for anyone that did join a little bit later, highly encourage using the Q&A function or the chat to ask any questions as we're going through. So now inhibitory controls. So when we're looking at inhibitory controls, this is about creating space before you react. So inhibitory controls, a lot of people think of this like attention, but it's a little bit more than just attention. It's your ability to pause and resist knee-jerk reactions and create space between stimulus and response. So it's also just more core to the core. Inhibitory controls is being able to filter out information that we don't think is important. So while I am presenting right now, if there was a radio on or a TV on in the background making a bunch of noise, I would have to filter out that noise to focus on what I'm reading from the slides and what I'm presenting on. So that is the very base of inhibitory controls. But inhibitory controls, it doesn't have to just be an external stimuli. It has to be also internal thoughts. So really just, I'll jump down to connect to the levers. Being able to choose what you focus on, inhibitory controls right there, because what you're doing is you're limiting, you might be changing where your focus is. So let me not focus on these things and focus on this part. So you're filtering out what you maybe previously have been focusing on to then focus on something different. That filter is our inhibitory controls. So if you can't pause, and so that's what the focus, I'll just jump to interpretation as well. Same thing, inner thoughts coming in of the way you interpret something, those are your thoughts coming in, but being able to say, wait, those thoughts aren't serving me. Let me try and interpret it a different way. You're pausing yourself and trying to filter out your thoughts to change what you're interpreting. And then the response is a big area. So by building in these pauses, you're able to pivot. If you can't stop what you're doing and then build in this filter, you can't pivot or change. So inhibitory controls allows us to not blurt out things, lash out, shut down, or lock into a rigid response before you've had a chance to think it through. Where this becomes challenging is when you may be speaking or acting before thinking. So if I had greater inhibitory controls, yesterday in my meeting where I'm trying to prove myself right, I may have stopped, said, what am I doing? It's not working. Maybe I should change my approach and not trying to prove myself right. Maybe I should try and ask more questions. But I didn't stop to think that inhibitory controls of stop your response wasn't happening. Can also lead to spiraling into overreaction or withdrawal, or shutting down alternative ideas or feedback, or falling into the same emotional or behavioral patterns repeatedly. So just some strategies to help build up your inhibitory controls could be the 3-second rule. This could be counting to 3 silently before responding in emotionally charged moments. I used to have above my desk a printed out sign that said, listen, wait, think, respond. And so what that was a visual prompt to remind me to lean into my inhibitory controls with my communication in meetings. It was very similar to the 3-second rule, because what I would try and do is I would try and look up and read the sign when I wanted to respond to someone. Another quick strategy before I go into the other ones, and this is more, this could, excuse me, sorry. So another strategy that I use with a lot of clients is, especially with response, but it could really apply to focus and interpretation, can be to write down, what am I focusing on? How am I interpreting it? And how do I want to respond? Just that action of writing these things down can really support you in building in time to strategize, building in time to make decisions instead of just reacting without thinking, like a knee-jerk reaction. Another one could be body-based interruption. So this could be doing a physical reset. So maybe unclenching your jaw, rolling your shoulders to interrupt the reflex. So there's just something about the way your brain works that if you make some physical action, you are able to build in a pause, because now instead of focusing on what you're going to interpret and respond to, you're changing where your body's focusing to some physical action. Sometimes this could even be just, I'm going to take a quick walk. Let me just run to the restroom. Things like that. You can also develop some anchor phrases. So practice saying things like, let me think about that, or give me a moment, to build in some default pauses. And then there could be some low stakes practice. So even just using your non-dominant hand for daily tasks. So this is just getting your brain to slow down a little bit. And so that's one of the key things here with inhibitory controls is it influences rigidity, because often rigidity is just doing without thinking. It's running on autopilot. And so a bunch of these are about stopping our autopilot and doing something different intentionally. So that's where that low stakes practice of try using your non-dominant hand, it helps build in restraint. So right now, I don't know if you guys can see, I have these little like Chinese meditation balls in my hand. Something what I do, I'm using my dominant hand, but if I needed to decrease my or try to increase my inhibitory controls, I may switch it over to the other hand, because now some of my focus is going towards making sure that I'm able to spin these balls. And that's slowing your brain down to be able to allow for some more inhibitory controls. So now we have emotional regulation. So this is about staying constructive and rational under stress. It doesn't just need to be stress. It's where we often see emotional regulation in work, but it could also be when we're feeling sad, when we're feeling down. It's just when our emotions are starting to take over, that's when we're emotionally dysregulated. So understanding this skill, emotional regulation is managing your emotional responses so they don't take over your behavior. It's staying grounded enough to think clearly under pressure. And when we have unregulated emotions, it leads to more rigid reactive thinking. Now, the key piece here is that when we're emotionally dysregulated, it almost leads to us not feeling safe. If any of you have ever had like anxiety before, you know that you're not really thinking strategically when you're anxious. You're just thinking to get, how do I get out of this anxious state? Your body enters that fight or flight response. And so you really get to this safety mindset of just trying to protect yourself. And when you're just trying to protect yourself, that is not strategic thinking. It's just reactive to try and get not anxious. So the point here is to try and stay steady because it gives you access to more flexible interpretations and choices. So how do we not get to a point of being anxious? Or when we get anxious, how do we not react because it's not going to serve us? And this is where you're seeing some overlap between inhibitory controls and emotional regulation, because the emotions you're feeling are thoughts running in our head that we're then not able to inhibit and filter out. So some common pitfalls here is when you might get hijacked by stress, shame, or anger, where you might be overreacting to neutral events or feedback, when you avoid challenges to avoid discomfort, and when you might be falling into default behaviors like shutting down and snapping. So, a great example of this is if you are anxious for something and your boss just gives you some constructive feedback, when you're not able to regulate those emotions, you might then start going into even more of a spiral. Oh my God, they're going to fire me. I'm not doing my job. They know how stressed out I am. And then it just spirals even further. And a key piece to understand here is when we make decisions while we're emotional, they tend to be irrational decisions. And so emotional decisions just almost are inherently not strategic because they are being based by emotions, which really are interpretations of the world as opposed to some objective facts. So, again, emotional regulation, if you are feeling threatened, if you're sad, you're going to focus on specific things. And so, if you're really sad, you might focus on certain things. If you're really anxious, you might focus on different things. Whereas your interpretation also, if you're feeling anxious and someone gives you feedback, you might interpret that as I'm going to be fired, as opposed to if you are more emotionally regulated, you might see that feedback and then may interpret that as, oh, they're being really nice. Okay, yeah, this will help me. And then it also influences the response because the more emotionally dysregulated you are, the less thinking about responses, the harder it is to have that inhibitory control because you are just reacting instead of strategizing a proactive response. So, some strategies to build up your emotional regulation include things like name it to tame it. So label your emotion to reduce its intensity. So that is just connecting over what emotion am I feeling. So this is something called meta emotional skills. So it's just being able to think about those emotions. And so if you are able to say, this is what anxious feels like, this is what agitated feels like, this is what frustrated feels like, that's the first step to also then going back to some of that metacognition. When I'm agitated, I don't collaborate well. And that is building up evidence for yourself of, okay, so now I know I'm in this emotional state. So the first step to being able to regulate your emotions is to know when you're feeling it. So labeling your emotion is often a first step with emotional regulation. Another is pause and pivot. So this is about like really, if you are able to identify that you're a bit emotionally dysregulated, you can stop and do some basic strategies like breathing exercises. So I'll give you all of many people are familiar with different breathing exercises, but if you're not, I'll give you a very simple one. It's called box breathing. And so it is 4 seconds in, you hold it for 4 seconds, and then you breathe out for 4 seconds. And then you hold it out for 4 seconds. And then you repeat that cycle 2 or 3 times. And you can keep doing it. But what you're doing is, and this is where I'm tying a lot of these things together, you are now shifting your focus from the emotion to your breathing. And then what you're doing is by focusing on your breathing, the intensity of those emotions tend to dampen a bit because you've shifted your focus. That kind of control your emotions had over you, they lose their control, and it's able to reframe it for you to now be able to approach it a bit better. There's many different breathing exercises that you can use. So if you don't like the box breathing, there's plenty you can look up. And there's other ways to ground yourself. As I mentioned before, it could be going on a walk, it could be getting some fresh air. One thing that I used to do is I shake my legs a lot. And so sometimes that helps ground myself when I'm feeling a certain way. Or different little fidgets and things can also help with grounding. The next is emotional checkpoints. So just check in with yourself 2 to 3 times a day. Just start thinking about those emotions, where you're at. Because if you do this 2 to 3 times a day, you're going to get better at the other two. You're going to get better at naming and taming it. It's hard to do this stuff in the moment. So if you just set aside some emotional checkpoints, you're going to get better at practicing and identifying those emotions. And then you can also try to reframe the feeling. So words are very powerful in how our brain interprets things. So if we are able to turn I'm anxious into I'm activated and alert, it's a way to start decreasing the power some of these emotions may have over you. So now strategic thinking. So this is about planning for flexibility. And this is really bigger picture, longer term. And so understanding the skill, it's mapping out options and anticipating scenarios before acting. So this might be choosing an approach that aligns with your long-term goals. It sets you up to be flexible by planning ahead. And without it, you either freeze or overreact or default to unhelpful habits. So I'm going to be a little mindful. This can be very similar to adaptability, which we'll talk about next, but it is different because strategic thinking is less in the moment. So as I'll continue with my example from yesterday. I can sit down and think about the next time I have this meeting, what can I do differently? What are different ways that I can focus? What should I be focusing on? I will say it's not so much interpretation because it's hard to plan ahead how you're going to interpret things because you don't know what other people are going to bring to the table. But it does help with response as well, because strategic thinking is really building in of there are different situations that may come up. Let me map out the different ways I could potentially respond. And so this is helping you set up your flexibility by planning ahead. So if you think about it in the moment, if you really want to brainstorm things you can focus on, you might not have enough time in the moment. If you really want to brainstorm your responses, you might not have enough time in the moment to do that either. But by thinking ahead of what I'm going to focus on, or what I can focus on, what are the different things? What are the different ways I can respond? You're giving your brain in the future a menu of options to be flexible from, versus in the moment where you're caught off guard and then you're going to revert to autopilot. This is especially helpful for people that process information a little bit slower or need time to process information. So I'll just jump to a quick strategy there. Sometimes in a meeting, it's better to not reply, not respond, and say, give me some time to think about it. Because what you're doing there is you're advocating to have some strategic thinking instead of trying to move ahead right away. So without this strategic thinking, you'll either freeze up, overreact, or default to some of these unhelpful habits. Now, some common pitfalls here is jumping into action without considering the outcome, overthinking and missing the moment to act, failing to plan for obstacles or alternate paths, or staying reactive instead of proactive. So some strategies to help build this up, there are different decision models that you can use. There's this ODA model, so observe, orient, decide, act. So what this is doing is really building in some strategy around this. How do I make decisions? So again, this goes a little bit to inhibitory controls. It's control your response. Don't reply right away. Don't respond right away. Let's build in a time for how we decide how to reply or respond. There's some if-then planning. So this really looks like if this happens, then I'll do this. If this happens, I'll do this. So this can be just like a menu if, and then a bunch of different things could happen. And these are the different ways I could respond. That way you're not just defaulting to one response with a variety of different situations. And you can build in some default strategy building. So this could be thinking ahead of, well, let me map out all these different ways that I can respond. And when you do this in advance, you're able to reflect on if those are the most strategic responses or not. There are plenty of other decision models. There's prioritization decision models like the Eisenhower matrix. Jeff Bezos from Amazon has a decision-making model as well. So there's just different ways, and these decision-making models are just inherently strategic thinking because you're making decisions within a model as opposed to making decisions reactively. You could also ask outcome-based questions. So what am I actually trying to achieve, and what's the best way to achieve it? And you can even be a bit self-critical here in reflecting on the past. So what was I trying to achieve, and did I use the best way to achieve it? This is a way to help convince your brain to build in time for strategic thinking. I'll just do a quick aside. A lot of these strategies that we're talking about, your brain is going to lie to you that they're inefficient and that I should just move ahead. But that's exactly what we're talking about throughout this entire presentation. That lie your brain is telling yourself is rigidity coming in the way. And when we'll talk a little bit more about hindsight is 2020, but being able to look back and really see, asking that question, retroactively, what was I actually trying to achieve, and did I choose the best way, helps prove to yourself that if I built in some time for strategic thinking, could I have actually achieved what I was trying to achieve? There is scenario planning where you can think through the best, worst, and most likely outcomes. This helps prepare you for different situations, which then can tie to what we talked about before, just in the decision models of like if-then planning. You're planning out different scenarios and thinking through what are different outcomes to better prepare yourself on how you can focus or respond to things. You can also set boundaries for clarity. So this could limit time or choices to help sharpen your focus. And so really trying to zone in on what are we trying to strategically be thinking about, strategically focus on, and then how can we strategize our responses? Again, strategizing takes time. And we make so many decisions through our day for the sake of efficiency, and we're making these decisions very rapidly, but it's important to think about that's not strategic. It may be efficient in the moment, but it's not always strategic for longer term growth. Now, the last of these 5 is adaptability. And so this is really the more in the moment and following through on change. So to understand the skill, it's adjusting your behavior, plan, or mindset in response to new information or changing circumstances. So even with all of your own strategic thinking, there still may be things you didn't think of. And having adaptability allows us more in the moment to make these changes. So this is about staying flexible while taking action. So great. I did an if-then map of all these different situations, and I have all of my different responses that I've really put thought into. But now you're in the moment and something different happens. You can freeze and rigidity kicks in and you revert back to it, or we can work on some strategies to help with being adaptable in the moment. So insight and intention mean little if you can't follow through when the plan shifts. So adaptability turns thinking into momentum. A great little example of like a common pitfall that I often see is when I'm working with professionals on using a calendar to help manage their time. When I'm doing this, I sometimes get a rigid response from people of, but I got a new meeting set up and my entire plan fell away, so I stopped using my calendar for the week. Well, that's rigidity. That's a lack of adaptability there. Whereas maybe you had an extra meeting set up and you have to shift around a couple of things, but it's not the biggest deal in the world. So where this can manifest as a challenge is exactly what I just shared. It could be clinging to the original plan even when it no longer works, or throwing out the entire plan because there was a slight change. This is where you can have some freezing when things go off script. Well, I didn't consider this outcome, so I'm frozen. It could be interpreting pivots as failure, and it can also be resisting feedback or course corrections. Now, that adaptability really is impacting all three levers of focus, interpretation, and response. So some strategies to build this up here could be building micro pivots. So practicing making small changes quickly. So the way that you go on a walk, try a different way. Just adapt it in the moment. It could be switching a tool. It could be, let me try a different app. Let me try this. It's just about mixing up so that your brain gets used to doing different things in the moment. If you drive to work, or maybe take a different route. If you're walking home, take a different route. Maybe instead of following the same exact routine every day, you mix it up a little bit. Adaptability can set off some defense mechanisms in our brain. And so that can then, when we have to adapt, it can then connect over to that emotional regulation. Because when something doesn't go according to plan, we could feel threatened. So building these micro pivots, just changing little things, are ways to get your brain more accustomed to things may change. You can also normalize feedback where you treat adjustments as progress and not setbacks. So this is really a mindset shift where instead of focusing on, oh, I'm being told to change this, and so you view that as, oh, now this is a setback. Oh my God, there's so much more work now. Or you can view it as, hey, you know what? This is going to take a little bit of extra work, but I think it really will improve the process. I can handle it. I'm going to make this a learning experience. And so that is just reframing how you interpret things so that you're able to have a better mindset in how you approach change. You could also practice plan B thinking, so getting comfortable with generating alternatives. And so this does tie a little bit to strategic thinking, but just getting used to that if it doesn't go the way I want, what is a plan B? Even if you're almost fully convinced that plan A is going to work, having a plan B isn't just about having a backup plan. It's helping us be more comfortable with things may not go according to plan and I may need to adapt in the moment. Again, a lot of these are about practice because it takes almost exposure to our brain and using our brains in these ways. And the more we use them this way, the easier it becomes. Just like when you go to the gym and you do a specific exercise, it gets easier to increase your weights the more you do that same exercise. You can also use some language cues. So you can say I'm adjusting instead of I messed up. And so this does tie back in a little bit to what I shared on the strategic thinking, but also with the normalizing feedback. What you're doing is you're trying to influence your mindset, which is really focusing on influencing your interpretation of things. So I'd love everyone that's listening to use the chat, and I want you to think about these 5 flexibility tools. Do you find, even if you didn't know the name of it, but after we talked through it, which one do you already lean on when things get tough? Or which one do you find is the hardest to use, or it disappears first when you're placed under pressure? And so I'd love just if you could just share in the chat, like my strength is one of these, and my weakness is one of these. And I'd love just to see if there's any common themes from everyone that's here. So I'll just give that a minute. I'll actually get myself a little bit more coffee because it's 8 a.m. here. One sec. All right. I don't really see anyone typing. So maybe I will. Okay, one. My weakness, I think, is adaptability. And adaptability is really hard because it really is in the moment. And so my biggest advice that I would do is try to lean on to more of the strategic thinking and metacognition. So you're able to then slowly identify where the adaptability challenges are. So strength and adaptability, and weakness is emotional regulation. Another strength is adaptability. And then another weakness is emotions, strength of metacognition. So one thing that we often focus on is it's okay to have weaknesses in some of these areas. And so one thing I do want all of you is reflecting on this. You can lean into your strengths to help compensate and work on the areas that are a weakness. So, for example, the last one I just got, metacognition is a strength, weakness is adaptability and emotional regulation. Well, you can lean into your strength of metacognition to better understand, why is adaptability hard? What are things that I can do that will set me up for better success with adaptability or with emotional regulation? And so that's where a lot of these, there are overlaps between them. And so maybe one takeaway you can take is, how can you use your strengths to try to compensate for where your weaknesses are? What can we do? So great, I just saw another one come in. Strength is emotional regulation and weakness is inhibitory controls. So if you're able to regulate your emotions, that's great, because that, if those were 2 weaknesses, which are common too, but you're able to filter out and regulate those emotions. So now you aren't getting irrational too often in your thought process, which will make it a little bit easier to then tap into some of those inhibitory control strategies that we discussed. Thank you, guys. I got nervous that no one was going to type in, so I really appreciate everyone sharing over. But write that down on a piece of paper, something. By just identifying where you have a weakness, now you can make a roadmap for yourself of, what are some strategies I can try out to build this up? Okay. So now let's move into applying the framework. So we're going to talk through this cognitive flexibility loop of finding and freeing the stuck point. So we're going to be going through recognizing the stuck point, identifying it, reframing, responding, and then reflecting. So when we're looking at recognize, this is just the first cue that something isn't working. It often shows up as tension, frustration, or mental rigidity. You might notice physical signs, tight shoulders, jaw clenching, emotional spikes, annoyance, panic, or mental patterns and looping thoughts. I'm right, they're wrong. This isn't knowing where the rigidity really is. It's just recognizing that rigidity is kicking in right now. So I like to compare over to like a smoke detector that's detecting a fire. When a smoke detector goes off, it's recognizing that there's smoke. There is no identification of where the smoke is coming from. And that is the best comparison here. Recognizing is simply knowing that rigidity, I don't know why, but there's rigidity, and it's recognizing it, and that's helping build in a pause. Some of the key questions to guide yourself here is, where am I feeling stuck? What feels off right now? And am I reacting instead of thinking? And the goal of this step is really to help build awareness that a shift might be needed. You don't know where the shift is needed yet, but you're just trying to build that awareness that it might be needed. And this is helping to create the pause that makes change possible. Now, when we move to identify, once you've recognized you're stuck, it's now about pinpointing where your flexibility is blocked. Is it within our focus? Are we locked onto one detail or ignoring a broader view? What about our interpretation? Are you stuck in one storyline or assumption and response? Are you reacting on autopilot? So key questions to ask here is, am I narrowing in on something unhelpful? How is this supporting me reaching my goals? Is my interpretation the only possible one? Are the other ways? Maybe I still believe my interpretation's right, but are there other ones potentially? And am I giving myself a range of responses, or am I only on autopilot and choosing one? And the goal here is to really diagnose the problem so that you know what lever you may need to shift, coming back to those 3 levers. With reframing, we're really looking at reframing the story to open new paths. So it's talking about how to change how you're viewing the situation. This step moves you from rigid to flexible by altering your internal narrative. Doesn't mean ignoring reality. It means expanding your mental options. And so some of the questions you might ask include, what else might be true? Or how might someone else see this? You can try flipping the question or using a yes and mindset. And you can also step away temporarily and say, let me think about this and get back to you. So, a great tool with reframing in this flexible loop is using that perspective taking aspect. How might someone else see this? How might someone else interpret this? And how might someone else respond to this? There is just something in our cognition when we think about others that frees us from our own biases. And so you can use a colleague and say, how might they interpret this? How might they respond to this? And that's helping reframe the way you're looking at it. And the goal here is to really interrupt the rigid story so that new possibilities can emerge. Then we have respond. So we want to be responding with intention, not impulse. So now that we've reframed, now we can choose a response that reflects flexible thinking, not just the quickest or easiest ones. And this is where our intention meets action. So just some tips here is, use your foundational skills, regulate your emotions, think strategically, adapt quickly, but you don't over perfect it. You want to choose directionally helpful next step. It doesn't have to be you're totally changing everything. You want to be keeping your response connected to your values or goals. So the goal here is for you to be taking thoughtful, goal-aligned action, even if it's small. Then lastly, we have reflecting to learn. So after the moment passes, you want to be looking back. What went well? What was hard? What would you try differently? And this is helping build up your self-monitoring muscle to help improve future flexibility. This is building up your metacognition. This is building up strategic thinking. By building in this pause to reflect, it's almost like you're able to give yourself a grade and say, did I do this well? What could I do different next time? And so some of the key questions here are, where did I shift well? Did I miss a stuck lever? And I'll catch it next time. And how do I want to handle a similar situation in the future? And the real goals here is to turn one flexible moment into long-term growth. So now really just to move into the last main section of our presentation today, from insight to integration. So you've learned how to spot rigidity, shift your thinking, and respond with flexibility. But let's explore to strengthen those muscles day by day, build habits that reinforce reflection, and integrate flexibility into your everyday decisions. Again, this doesn't just need to be professional. This could be throughout your life, because if you practice it in one domain, you're building up the muscles in your brain to be able to then apply it in other domains. So I've mentioned this word self-monitoring a couple of times. And self-monitoring is learning from experience. And so it's the ongoing practice of noticing what happened, how you responded, and what you want to do differently next time. It's not self-criticism, it's self-guided adjustment. It's virtually giving yourself a grade and being able to understand. It's also not just in the reflecting on the past, it can be in the moment. Is what I'm doing helping me move forward? Am I on track to achieving my goals? And so it supports flexibility because rigidity thrives on autopilot, but self-monitoring helps break that cycle. It strengthens the reflect step in the cognitive flexibility loop. It builds up that last step in that loop. It helps you recognize patterns, what triggers your rigidity, which levers you tend to forget, and it builds metacognitive awareness, turning daily moments into long-term growth. And so self-monitoring, let's say you have let's say you go into a meeting and you want to really self-monitor how you're communicating with your colleagues. Are you supporting and adding to a positive culture and adding to positive outcomes as well? And so maybe what you do is 15 minutes into a meeting, give yourself a little 1 to 10 score. I'm at a 6. And so just by self-monitoring, maybe writing that down, I'm at a 6. Now you're giving yourself some feedback of, okay, so what can I do strategically to try and get that 6 up to an 8? And so self-monitoring is almost the feedback for us to know how well we're doing. And that could be both in the moment or after. How flexible am I being in my communication? How flexible am I being in my responses? So a way to practice self-monitoring is, so I mentioned earlier about hindsight is 2020. This principle is exactly where self-monitoring can be so impactful. Because if hindsight's 2020 and you can reflect and you know what the best decision would have been, it's just it was a week ago, well, that's useful for the next time you might come up into a similar situation. So one might be a rigidity journal. So after a frustrating moment, write down what happened, what you assumed, and what you did, and then what you could have done differently. Again, this is just building in that reflect piece, but it's really diving into grading yourself so that you can identify better where you're rigid. The more you identify, with hindsight being 2020, the easier it's going to become to identify it in the moment to help with your adaptability. There can be goal outcome reviews. So at the end of the day or a project, ask yourself, what was my goal? Did I meet it? And where did I limit myself? What could I have done differently to get me there more efficiently? You could have a stuck lever log. So from those 3 levers in terms of focus, interpretation, and response, you can have a little log where you're tracking that. Are you feeling like you're stuck focusing on one thing, or feeling like you're stuck in one interpretation model, feeling like you're stuck on one response? A lot of what we're doing here with self-monitoring is understanding as much as possible where the problems are starting so that you can lean into some of those strategies and approaches to address the problem. I'm not expecting any of you to walk away and use every single strategy here. But self-monitoring can help you focus on where and which strategies are most important for you to be using. You could also have, again, this is similar to some of the strategy before, but a future script practice. Write how you want to handle a similar situation next time. Keep it short, clear, and intentional. And then reflect and self-monitor. Did you use that strategy in that future situation or not? How well did you use it or not? And that's self-monitoring kicking in. So in the moment, flexibility is hard, and we often revert to this autopilot. But structured self-monitoring helps us retrace where we are rigid, understand what triggered it, and build a mental library of alternatives so that the next time flexibility feels more accessible. So now let's just go through some fun things about training your brain. So these are some low stakes, repeatable mental workouts that keep your cognitive flexibility sharp. And you can think of your brain like your body. Flexibility grows through consistent stretching, not just in big moments. So these are just some fun ones. Crosswords and wordplay. So anything that's really how you look at things, even word searches, crosswords have a lot of puns with different meanings. These actually are shown to increase your cognitive flexibility. We did talk about a little bit like take a new route home, just mixing things up. Again, you're proving to your brain that there's different ways to get to the same destination, different ways to do things. Maybe I don't know. I'm a big cooker. I don't know if some of you guys are, but maybe cook your favorite meal using some different ingredients. Mix it up a little bit. Approach it a little bit. Maybe you always have like chicken and rice together. Maybe mix it up, chicken and potatoes. Just these little ways of exposing your brain to different routes, different approaches helps with that flexibility. Strategy games, chess being a top one, is really good for flexibility. Genre swapping media, so choosing different things that you're watching just to view things differently. You could have puns and associations, using your non-dominant hand, and doing different perspective taking exercises. This could either be with colleagues, this could be with friends, or this could be by yourself. Now, here's a little pun. It's a little cut off, so I'll read it to you. But hey, bug on my back, are you a mite? I might be. That is the dumbest pun I have ever heard. And then the mite replies, what do you expect? I just made it up on the fly. So there, it's just showing that words can have different meanings, and getting our brain used to those different meanings in a fun, accessible way is a fun way to be training your brain to be more flexible. And I know these seem silly, but they really do help. It's not always in work context that we practice our flexibility. You can practice your flexibility in different situations and some low stakes ones like this. So practice and habit building. So without this daily reinforcement, we can fall back into our rigid patterns. So building flexibility into routines helps it show up when it counts under pressure, in feedback, and during transitions. So you might want to start with just one daily check-in with yourself. Check in and see, where have I been flexible? Where have I not been? You can anchor it to existing routines. So if you like, I am a coffee person in the morning, maybe just sitting down and building in some flexibility and reflection there. That can help where you're pairing it with something that you're already doing. You can use some visual reminders for yourself. You can have a little sticky note on your desk that says things about remember you're flexible, remember your levers. Here are my tools for flexibility. You can track it weekly in a self-monitoring sense, so you can be grading yourself and referring back to it weekly. And you could also have a buddy system. There are 41 other people here. There could be a buddy where you guys try to practice this flexibility together, hold each other accountable, or even exploring options like coaching. This could also be something that if you have a manager or you have a boss, that maybe you talk with them about supporting on this. So I'd love to ask you guys, does anyone have a routine that they can think of where they could embed just a 30-second flexibility check-in? Just asking yourself, even if it's writing down or even if it's just in your own head, of have I been flexible? Where have I limited myself? Does anyone have some examples they'd like to share in the chat about some routines they could tie it to? The one for me is like brushing my teeth while I'm brushing my teeth, reflecting on either yesterday in the morning or the day during the night. That could be one flexibility check-in. It's just tied to that, and I would think about it in my own head. So while anyone else is thinking about any routines that they have existing where they can embed it in, share it over in the chat because it might give some ideas to others of where they can build in some of these flexibility check-ins. And then I will also, just before fully going into this, I did want taking a shower is a great one. Just did want to give a heads up. We are approaching the end of the presentation. So if you do have questions, you can begin thinking of them or typing them in. So now looking at some integration and application, flexibility is not just about responding to problems. It's about proactively shaping how you work and connect. So in some contexts, so we'll go through leadership, team dynamics, transitions and change, and personal growth. So with leadership, when we're rigid, we may stick to one communication style or decision model. But when we're flexible, we're able to adapt to approach our team goals and changing circumstances. So some of the worst leaders, I don't want to say worse, you're limiting yourself as a leader if you only hire people that work with your communication style. That's rigidity. You might hire people and then fire them because they're not adapting to your rigidity. Versus a more strategic leader is going to be someone that sees that if I can control and change and be flexible with my communication style, I may be able to bring out the best from my team. With team dynamics, when we're rigid, we may shut down opposing ideas and take feedback personally. But when we're flexible, we're able to embrace multiple perspectives, collaborate towards solutions. There's also transitions and change. So it can be when we're rigid, it resists new roles. Like imagine you really struggle with transitions and change because you're very rigid. You might not be promoted. Or if you are promoted, you might get fired from that promotion. And that could be really resisting these new roles, routines, or structures out of fear or habit. But when we're flexible, we're able to reframe challenges as opportunities for growth. Then we have personal growth. And so when we're rigid, this can lead to avoiding feedback, repeating unhelpful habits, or feeling threatened by change. But when we're flexible, we're able to reflect, course correct, and use discomfort as a learning signal. And so just some strategies that you guys can begin applying tomorrow. Ask what else might be true in a team conversation. You can notice what is your go-to lever, focus, interpretation, or response, and try shifting another one. Maybe you're always changing your response, but maybe what am I focusing on? And trying to use the loop of recognize, reframe, respond, reflect on one situation this week. So thank you very much. And I will open the floor if anyone has any questions.
Thank you, Casey. Thank you very much for the insightful session. It was interesting and it was quite thought-provoking. Thank you once more. So, for me, one key takeaway of the session was the fact that cognitive flexibility is not just about us thinking fast, right? So, like what you like what you shared earlier, it's about us noticing when we're stuck. It's about us reframing our perspectives, if I'm right. And it's also about us intentionally choosing our thoughtful and goal-aligned actions, right? So now it's time for our question and answer session. It's time for our question and answer session. So for everyone who has questions, for everyone who would like to share their thoughts, this is the time for you to do so. You can do that in the chat box, right? So we'll be taking, and if you'd also like to share your questions verbally, you can raise up your virtual hands. Okay, so we have our first question from Rejoice. Rejoice says, is it okay to stick with a system or a structure in our lifestyle that works very well for us? How much time is really okay to stick to one system, and when does it get unhealthy?
So it's okay to stick with, like, again, strategic and rational. If it's working, great. Like, we don't just want to change things to change things that are really working for you. You may want to change some things just to build up your cognitive flexibility. But what's important here is it only gets unhealthy when there's a spillover to other parts of your life. So if you have a routine and it's just working for you, great. But be prepared that that routine or that system may need to change. And so the only way I would say it ever gets really unhealthy is if you are so married to that system that if a changing circumstance comes up, that you're going to be so upset if that system has to change. But you really should stick with things that are working. What this flexibility is more about is being able to understand when something you're doing isn't working for you. And so I don't want anyone going out of their way to change things that are working. The whole point of this is that if you don't stop to ask yourself that question, is this working for me? That's when you're losing your strategic approach. Just you saying a system in my lifestyle is working very well for you. You've stopped, you've thought about it, and it's working. Keep doing it. But if you find that you are telling yourself every single system is working for you all the time and you never want to change anything, that might be, you might want to have a little bit of a self-criticism question, of just slightly asking yourself, is it possible that everything is working for me perfectly? Probably not. But if there's one or two areas and you are focusing on being flexible in other areas of your life, keep doing the things that are working. Okay. What's the best one? Yeah, no problem.
Thank you, Casey. So Fatima asked, what is the best way to overcome fear in trying out a new strategy?
So you probably want to try out. So fear of trying a new strategy is trying to understand where that fear is coming from. So is it just fear in trying new things? That's rigidity. That's the lie rigidity's telling you. But what if it was fear about trying a new strategy that could have a really big impact on your life? So you're interviewing for like your dream job, let's say. Maybe not the best time to try a new strategy for like a really high stakes situation. And fear there might be somewhat justified. Is this the best time to try something new? But if you are just having fear in general of trying new strategies, my recommendation is try with some low stakes things, a different walk home. And it's almost like there's a therapy approach called exposure therapy, where just by exposing you to these things, you can then decrease your fear. So when I'm working with clients, we try to identify what if we just did this differently? And then we ask the question, what's the worst that can happen? And then that way we're reframing, okay, so I'm having this big fear response, but really the worst that could happen is that I have to spend an extra 20 minutes doing something, or I may be 10 minutes late. And then we're like, well, is that outcome, is the fear normal? And then it's often like, well, no, now that I'm thinking about it rationally, that fear isn't normal. So I would like to just simplify that. I would just try different things in areas that the fear is irrational so that it helps expose you that that fear isn't a rational thought. Fear, again, is tapping into our stress and not feeling safe. So expose yourself to some changes at first that aren't that big of a deal so that you get more used to that fear and you're able to name that emotion and then be able to tamp it down. And then you can slowly build up that courage of trying new things because maybe you've shown in the past that when I try different things, it does lead to better outcomes. And so you're building up evidence that that fear response is wrong.
Thank you, Casey. So next we have a question from Celestine. Thank you for this insightful session. Should I always look out for what others would say before I take certain actions or decisions?
Not always, because that's not flexible, right? So it's not always, but it is useful if you find that you reply too quickly, you respond too quickly. You may want to lead a little bit into understanding what others would say. So I think a great thing to do here is to try and ask questions. So that's a great strategy that you can try out. So instead of just looking out for what others would say, you could also just ask, what do you think? How would you approach this? Which is doing a couple of things of building in a break, forcing you to stop and think, but also perspective gaining from asking from others' views. So I think the more information you have from others, the more you're able to strategize and approach things and take certain actions. I hope that answered the question.
Okay, yes, it did. Thank you, Casey. So next we have a question from Nixon. Thank you for the session. As we're trying everything new, we tend to revert back to what we've been accustomed to. How best can we maintain resilience as we implement new strategies?
Don't try everything at once. Start small and focused, intentional. So, what's really important is that new approaches, new behaviors, new routines can take 3 months of focused effort to become normal for you. So, as you said, Reverting back to what you're accustomed to, the way our brains work is there's little neural pathways, like a path through the woods. The more you walk it, the more clear the path becomes. But the less you walk it, it's going to get grown with vegetation and plants again. So that is our strategies and approaches that we do. So if you stay focused on trying a new strategy, the old strategies, old ways of thinking begin to get filled in. And the new strategies become the new efficient path. So the most important thing in adopting new strategies is it's not just about doing it the first time. It's not even just about doing it the second time. It's about doing it the third, fourth, and fifth, and continuing to do it so that the old behavior no longer becomes your autopilot. The old strategy is no longer your autopilot. The new strategy becomes your new autopilot. And so simply focus on one, two, maybe three things at a time so that you can master those as behaviors, and then you can move to developing other strategies. But you don't want to overextend yourself in trying to do too many new things at once, because you're not giving your brain the time to really carve out those neural pathways so that they become your new autopilot.
Okay, thank you. So next we have a question from Kiran. Kiran, what is the best way to share workload when many a times most or all responsibilities come on you?
So to share workload when many times most or all responsibilities come on you. So it really depends where you are in a position in an organization. So it's if you are a manager or leading people, then that is up to you to learn how to delegate tasks and train people you're managing. If you are being managed by someone else and they're the ones giving you a lot of a workload, that is where you lean a bit into self-advocacy of, I can't handle all of this work or all of these responsibilities. And so there really is two main tools there. One is if it is being assigned to you by someone else is to advocate in clear ways. So one strategy with that might be mapping out all the things you have to do, mapping out how long each of them takes, and showing that it's just not possible to do everything. The other way is if you are managing others, it's learning how to train them up to be able to then support in those responsibilities, where you can then eventually delegate those responsibilities over to them.
Okay, thank you. So we're still taking questions. If you have more questions, kindly drop them in the chat box. So I'm just going to go ahead to ask my question. So is there a limit to flexibility? Like, is there a risk of being too, like, if one starts to practice flexibility, is there a risk of being maybe too flexible, or maybe it could end up with us losing focus or losing direction in achieving our long-term goals?
So yes and no. So no, there isn't a consequence of being too flexible, because really what we were talking about through this, all of this is that flexibility is simply building in the time to be more strategic. of seeing there are multiple ways to focus, interpret, and respond. Where it can become problematic is in the follow through on things. And so that's a different skill. So that ties a little bit to was it Nixon's question? Yeah, so Nixon's question. So it's not that flexibility is ever a problem. It's that if you keep jumping behind and you don't lean into some of that self-monitoring of seeing what works, actually, it also ties back to what was the other, where was it? From Rejoice's question. So when things work, yeah, you want to keep up with them. But even with Rejoice and what she says is really working for herself, that doesn't mean she should ever stop and say, hey, is this still working for me? Let me be flexible in thinking about it. Is this system still working? Because one of the first things we brought up was about, or one of the first comments was about AI and embracing AI. Just because you had another system that works for you, like you still need to be flexible to see that there may be other systems that work. So I think it's not so much that being flexible is ever a problem. It's about what you follow through with. So I guess let me share it this way. There are plenty of times when I'm going through some cognitive flexibility with people that I'm working with, that when we're brainstorming ideas, we brainstorm bad ideas too. And so flexibility isn't always about coming up with the best ideas, but it's making sure that you're always being self-critical and making sure that you are making the most rational and best choice and not just always going on autopilot. And so what works for us today may not work for us in a year from now, but maybe today was my flexible idea from a year ago. But now a year is going to change. I want to be flexible again. But flexible doesn't mean that my new thing has to change. It just means I'm approaching it again with a flexible mindset to be able to be objective and see and ask those critical questions on if this was still working for me. Is this still helping me get to my goals? Or do I need to change something? So I think the only time flexibility can become a problem is when we don't give ourselves time to adopt and master new strategies or approaches, and we're just constantly bouncing between options. And that's why in the cognitive flexibility loop, we did build in that reflect stage to see, did this serve me or not? Did this help or not? And so as long as you're building in that check on yourself, you're still good to move ahead.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Casey. That was insightful. So, I don't see any more questions here. Just a little comment. Fatima says, thank you so much. That's a great advice. Okay. Now that, thank you all for your enthusiasm. Thank you all for your participation. Thank you everyone for your questions too. So, and one special shout out to Casey for sharing his wisdom, his expertise, and for sharing the practical insights with us today. So we really do hope that this session has left every one of us inspired, and it has equipped us with actionable strategies to enhance our communication skills, our networking skills, right? So, and then before we wrap up, let's not forget, let's stay connected, join our LinkedIn community, and you can also visit our webpage to continue the conversation. To continue the conversation, and let's not forget to sign up for the next expert-led session. That's the June expert-led session. The link has been dropped in the chat box. So you can sign up for the next expert-led session, and let's continue to explore more growth opportunities. So thank you all once again for being here. Thank you all once again for being here. Your engagement was truly inspiring. And with this, we'd call it a day.
Thank you so much for having me. Bye-bye.
Bye.